Good morning. This morning I would like to base my Dharma talk on a poem by the poet Mirabai. Mirabai was a poet that lived in the 15th century in India. She was a Hindu and has written many, many beautiful poems, and this is one of my very favorite. And it starts out this way. Mirabai says, listen, my friend, the road, the spiritual journey, is the heart opening. The road is the heart opening. Kissing his feet, resistance broken, tears all night. If we could reach the Lord through immersion in water, I would have asked to be born a fish in this life. If we could reach him through nothing but berries and wild nuts, then surely the saints would have been born monkeys when they came from the womb. If we could reach him by munching lettuce leaves and dry leaves from the trees, then the goats would surely go to the Holy One before us. If the worship of stone statues could bring us all the way, I would have adored a granite mountain long time ago. Mirabai says, the heat of midnight tears will bring you to God. The heat of midnight tears will bring you to God. So let's unpack that. That's an interesting poem, and let's talk about not necessarily what it means, because I don't know what she meant when she wrote it, but I can tell you what it means to me. Midnight tears, to me, tears refer, of course, to grief, to loss, to sadness. And the midnight tears refer to the unseen, the unacknowledged, the hidden tears, the hidden grief, the hidden sadness that we all feel. Or the sadness that we feel that we don't even know that we feel sometimes. You know, today in our world, we are awash with a tidal wave of grief. We are surrounded by loss, death, suffering, illness, economic loss, racial injustice, political corruption, all sorts of disruptions to our lives at the very least, and tragedy for many. But just ordinary human life involved a great deal of grief, even on top of all of the add-ons that we've had this past year with the COVID. In fact, the very first noble truth that the Buddha taught was life is dukkha. Dukkha, often referred to as suffering, can also be referred to as unsatisfactoriness or resistance, or basically unhappiness. And the Buddha talked a lot about dukkha. Many times he says, I teach suffering, aka dukkha, and only suffering and the freedom from suffering. So he talked about many types of dukkha. And I'd like to mention the three types of dukkha that he identified. The first type, and I want to forewarn you, I'm not making this up. This is right out of the Buddhist scriptures. The first type of dukkha is called dukkha dukkha. And it is the dukkha that we experience living a human life. The many, many losses that we have, seen and unseen, physical, emotional, mental, relational, losses of what we had, losses of what we never had, the dukkha of everyday life. There's dukkha at the physical level, physical death, pain, separation. There's emotional dukkha. There's the dukkha of unfulfilled desires, unmet needs, the dukkha of abuse or neglect, and on and on and on. Life is difficult. Life is full of dukkha dukkha. Second type of dukkha he called viparinama dukkha, which is the dukkha associated with our resistance to change. It's when we suffer because we hold on to something that's leaving, or we resist something that's arising. That type of dukkha is viparinama dukkha. Very much tied with impermanence and our resistance to impermanence. And the third type of dukkha is very subtle. It's called sankhara dukkha. It's called the dukkha of existence, the suffering of existence. And it's the suffering of simply living in a physical form, living in a physical body, having to maintain a physical body, to live in a human existence separated from our true nature, from our Buddha nature. In another sutra, the Buddha said to his monks, he says, "Which do you think is greater, the water in all the oceans of the earth, or the tears you shed while wandering on?" Wandering on refers to the cycle of samsara, of death and rebirth, the endless cycle of death, rebirth, driven by craving and desire. And his answer, of course, was the tears are greater. So, the Buddha taught suffering. Everyday life brings suffering. And much of the work that we do is to learn to let go in a way where we're not suffering. And that is the paradox of oftentimes it takes pain to overcome suffering. To feel grief without adding any story to it, to feel grief without adding any resistance or any victimhood to it, or blame or anything else. Simple grief, simple sadness, feeling the loss, the many, many losses that we all have in living our life. And for those of us on the spiritual journey, there's an even deeper layer of midnight tears, if you will. In the Tao Te Ching, verse number 48, it says, "In the pursuit of knowledge, every day something is gained." You know, when we're students, I always loved to be in school because I loved to learn. I always felt like I was gaining something every day. I was getting bigger. I was acquiring something. But in the practice of the Tao, in the spiritual practice, every day something is dropped, something is released. So the journey is not one of adding on to, but one of letting go. And in the early Buddhist tradition, about the only thing you could do if you wanted to be a Buddhist, if you wanted to practice the Dharma, was to become a monk or a nun, because that was the only form of practice. And for many years, many centuries I should say, that only the monastics really were practicing the Dharma fully. So when one became a monk or a nun, you gave up everything. It didn't matter how rich you were, it didn't matter how famous you were, everybody was the same. You let go of everything, even your clothing and even your hair. So your identity, even your gender identity, and everything involved taking on the vow of simple renunciation. Renunciation meaning I let go of all that I thought that I was. I let go of all possessions, both psychological and material possessions. In Christianity, we look at the Gospels. Oftentimes there's stories of people that approach Jesus and say, I want to become a disciple of yours. I want to follow the way, the teachings. What shall I do? And Jesus would say, let go of everything and come follow me. Sell everything you got, give the money to the poor, and come and see me. So the path today doesn't necessarily involve being a monastic. It doesn't involve shaving our head, although many of us have lost a little bit of hair in the process. But that's the least of what we've lost. Even though we have cars, even though we live a relatively luxurious life by the standards of many people, sometimes I chuckle when I hear, I was talking with a monastic one time, and he says, you Westerners, he says, you talk about living the middle way. He says, when I look around, he says, I would call this the upper middle way. This is the luxurious Dharma. But the point is, letting go doesn't necessarily mean not having a car or not having possessions, but it means not being attached to any of it. Particularly in our situation, most of us were more attached to our psychological possessions. We're more attached to our identities. We're more attached to our roles. We're more attached to our belief systems, to our feelings, and to the way we think things should be. And even to the way that we think things are. We're attached to that. So letting go is not easy. And it involves a lot of midnight tears. Why is it that all this letting go is necessary? Why is it that the heat of midnight tears will bring us closer to God, closer to our own true nature? The answer is that we're already are our own true nature. But we have all of these delusions and attachments that, in the words of the Buddha, cover our eyes with dust. We don't see clearly. We don't see reality. We see through the delusional vision of our attachments and our illusions and our false beliefs. So as we let go of these, we're simply discovering what's already been there. It's like pulling the curtains apart and letting the sun in. The sun's always been there. But if we have curtains up that block the sun, we can't see it. We wouldn't know the difference. So I'd like to close with this story. It was first told to me as a child's story, a children's story, but it's not a children's story, believe me. It's called The Knight in the Perfect Armor. Once upon a time, there was a knight who was renowned throughout the land, and he retired and started a family. He had a wife and some children that he loved very much. But there was a war brewing in another land, and the king needed him to lead a regiment into battle. And so he contacted this knight, and the knight said, well, sire, I'm very reluctant to leave my family. I might get hurt or killed, and my family then would starve. They couldn't survive. And the king said, well, I'll tell you what. He says, I'll give you a perfect set of armor. I'll give you armor that cannot be dented. It cannot be cut. It cannot be... There's no sword. There's no axe. There is nothing on this earth that can even scratch this armor. I guarantee you'll be safe. So the knight said, okay, sounds like a deal. He put on the armor, went into battle, and sure enough, he led his troops into battle, and he was courageous, and he came back a hero, and he came back with his shiny armor to the cheering crowds, and everybody was proud of him, and his wife was proud of him, and his children were proud of him. And so then he went home, and he started to take off his armor, and he realized there was some fine print in the contract that he hadn't read. the king didn't tell him that the armor was permanent, that it would not come off. And so here, this knight, whose identity and whose sense of being was all tied up into being this knight in shiny armor, was stuck in it. And it was preventing him from being a husband or a father, preventing him from kissing his wife and from hugging his children. And so as days went on, he began to feel more lonely and more sad. And his children missed him, and his wife missed him, and the whole family was not happy. And the knight became very, very sad and wished that he never donned the armor. And one night, he became so sad that he was considering ending his life, but he discovered he couldn't even do that because the armor was so perfect, so impenetrable. So he gave up everything. He just let go totally. And he began to weep. First time in decades that he ever wept. And suddenly, he discovered the only thing that would begin to dissolve his armor was his own tears. And as he wept, the armor began to dissolve. Little by little, it washed away. And he recognized that as the armor dissolved, his heart opened, and he could feel the love that he had for his family and for himself, and even for the country and the king. So we're much like that knight in perfect armor, It's like the very thing that gives us pleasure at one point in our life causes us to suffer at other times in our life if we can't let it go. So letting go means grieving, but letting go also means opening up to endless possibilities. If I let go of everything, anything's possible. Impermanence just doesn't mean death, but it also means birth. So as Trungpa Rinpoche used to say, one Buddhist teacher, we may feel like we're falling, but the good news is there's no ground to land on, you see. And in that falling, what we may discover is that we can fly. And maybe we could always fly, but we never realized it because we had this illusory ground that we were holding on to. So there's a happy ending to this. The midnight tears will free us. And the practice, tear by tear, whether they're literal tears or not, they don't have to be, of course, but that sense of release and letting go, that's what brings us closer to God or to our true nature. So let's just take a moment and reflect upon that story, upon the teaching, upon the truth of the Dharma. And so I'll close by saying thank you for sharing your practice with us.